Our next speaker, Lenore Blum, is a very distinguished mathematician and computer scientist who's been a pioneer of many things, including studies of fundamental studies of computer science and complexity. And we are lucky she came all the way from the US to tell us about her ideas of consciousness.
Here. Here's a rope. I can't get it. Well, first of all, I want to thank Sonia and everybody who invited me here. This has been so fantastic. The talks so far are daunting, and everybody I've met is just fantastic. So I'm going to talk about consciousness through a theoretical computer science lens. Okay, that's my goal here. And this is joint work with Melon and Blum, and Avram actually is our in-house machine learning expert. We go to him for advice. Okay. So theoretical computer science is a branch of mathematics that studies computation given limited resources, time and space. So this is how it differs actually from the classical Turing theory, which assumes these resources are unbounded. So that's a very big difference people do in theoretical computer science. And and mathematics, as we know, differs from a scientific method. It abstracts, it formalizes informal notions, it proposes axioms and derives results. Okay, so in a way, we're as mathematicians, we're kind of fortunate because we can sort of live in our own bubble. We can just create theories and derive results, and hopefully these results have some meaning too. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is the conscious Turing machine, which is inspired in part by Alan Turing's simple yet powerful model of computation, and cognitive neuroscience, Bernard Barr's global workspace theory of consciousness, and you heard a little bit about that. And we call it the theater model. And so what Barr's does is he considers consciousness as the activity of actors in a play performing on a stage of working and short-term memory, me. And the performance is under observation by a huge audience of powerful but unconscious processors in long-term memory that are sitting in the dark. Okay, that's you guys. And the unconscious processors vie amongst themselves to get their scripts or their information on stage to be broadcast to the whole audience. So you want to get some info questions up here to be broadcast to the whole audience. So many people have had this experience. You're at a party and you see somebody you know, but for the life of you, you can't remember their name. And then maybe you're driving home and a half hour later, her name pops up. Too late to do anything, but what's going on? Okay, so some processor is really embarrassed. It's one of these processes in the audience are really embarrassed that you can't remember her name, and it sends up a signal to the stage saying, what's her name? And then when it's up there, the actor sort of says, what's her name? And the processors are all sort of thinking about it. And a processor will call where you first met, maybe here in Oxford. Okay, that gets up on stage, gets broadcast. Another processor has been thinking, remember something from what she does. She's a neuroscientist who's working in consciousness, gets up here, gets broadcast down. Her name begins with R. If you already get it, it gets broadcast, and a half hour later, her name Roni comes up to the stage from the audience, which has been thinking, searching. And the conscious self is not privy to the working of the unconsciousness. So before I go ahead, I want to say what the conscious Turing machine is not. So the conscious Turing machine is not a Turing machine. There are a lot of reasons it's not. It has a finite lifetime. Is it the feeling of consciousness? It's not the input-output nut. It's not the function. And it's not the computing power, but it's what's under the hood. And maybe you'll see some of what's under the hood here. And it's also not a standard global workspace model either. First of all, it's a well-defined mathematical model. It has a well-defined competition for the audience members to get their information up on stage. It has no central executive. But importantly, that the CTM's subjective feelings of consciousness arise from the coevolution of what we call brainish, CTM's self-generated multimodal internal language and the model of the world. And I'd like to focus on that But also, I want to finally say that the CTM is not a model of the brain. It's way too simple for that. Okay, so what I'd like to do is give a brief overview of the model, the CTM, and define these two notions of consciousness in the model. So the first is conscious attention, which is analogous to what's called access consciousness. And the second is conscious awareness, which might be the subjective part or the phenomenological part that Johannes was talking about. And this will depend on the coevolution of brainish and the model of the world. So the CTM is defined formally as a seven-tuple. Time is measured in discrete clock ticks. And the CTM is born at time 0, and CTM has a finite lifetime. And here we go into all the parts and the details of these parts, which I will not do here. What I'm going to do here is giving you a cartoon picture of what the CTM is. So we start with a tiny short-term memory. That's our stage here. And that stage can hold one chunk of information. And then we have a huge audience of unconscious processors. These are powerful processors. We're thinking maybe more than 10 to the 7th. There are 10 to the 7th cortical columns in the brain. So we're thinking of a very large number of powerful processors. And these processes start out independently. So there are no links at the beginning. So this is our audience down here. And built into these long-term memory processors, there are predictive learning algorithms built into these processors. And then we have some special processors. So the input processors, for example, like sensor processors, output processors like motor processors, and then we have some gauge processors like a fuel gauge. But all other processors are generic to start. So each long-term memory processor has its own internal language, but processors communicate within CTM in a multimodal language, which we call brainish. And what brainish does is it fuses words, images, sounds, smells, sensations. So think about a frame in a dream where you might have a picture, you might have some sound, you might have some color. You actually might have a feeling. You're afraid or angry in that frame. So this is what brainish does, is it fuses all those parts. So for example, the brainish label for a rose might be a fusion of the red color, the sweet smell, the soft touch of a petal. And so the way the processors get their information on stage is through what we call an up-tree competition. And at each moment in time, each long-term memory processor puts a chunk of information into this competition. And this competition is a little bit like a tennis tournament. Pairs of chunks compete with each other and go up a level, and then they compete again, and they compete again. And in the literature, the notion of chunk is always talked about, but very informally. It's like a bit of information, a phrase, a short paragraph or so, but we need to give a definite definition. So here's what a chunk is. A chunk is a 4-tuple plus some auxiliary information. And it will start with the address of the processor that put the chunk into the up-tree competition. So if there are 10 to the 7th processors, that would be a 7-digit number. The time that it was put in, at most a 10-digit number. And then there's a gist, which will be that succinct information in brainish. And again, brainish or a gist at the frame in the dream. And then the weight is a valence number. It's positive or negative, and it is the importance value or confidence that the processor gives the gist. And our up-tree competition, for many reasons, is purposely probabilistic. The formal competition algorithm includes a coin flip neuron at each node. Okay, so when we get the winner on stage, it's immediately broadcast to the whole audience, and we call that winner the conscious content. And now we have our very first definition of conscious attention in the conscious Turing machine. So the conscious attention in the CTM is defined to be the reception by the broadcasted trunk, the global broadcast to all long-term memory processes. When you get all this information that's coming in, you're paying attention. That's conscious attention. Okay, so this is mostly the global workspace notion of attention, conscious attention. It's sort of what's called access consciousness. It was what came in with the what's her name scenario. It also demonstrates the Libet effect. So the winning chunk, right, that gets broadcast and he's paying conscious attention, that was put into the competition some milliseconds before. In fact, in humans, maybe 250 milliseconds, and some comparable amount in our CTM that was put in before it became conscious, before the CTM became conscious of it. Okay, so now what happens is the processors store all broadcasted chunks, and this forms a global dictionary. So they have the list of all the chunks that they've seen, and this will come up shortly. And we have some triggers. If the broadcasted chunk has a weight whose absolute value is higher than some threshold, we say that all processors must inspect that chunk, and I'll tell you what inspect is very shortly because that's very important. And all processes must try to reduce extreme negativity. So if the broadcasted chunk has a very high negative value, all processors are commanded to try to do something to lower those weights. Okay, and as I said before, the processors are independent to start, but after a while links form, and we have a Hebbian-like principle that processors that have common interests start linking together. And so what links do is they change very slow computation between communication between processors into very fast computation. So if you learn to ride a bike, everything is done very consciously at first, and after a while, it's totally unconscious. You don't even think about it. So this is what links do. They turn very slow conscious communication into fast unconscious communication. And finally here, I want to say that the CTM is not a brain in isolation. It interacts with the outside world. So input comes in through sensors, like eyes, ear, nose, into input processors, and output goes from output processors that trigger actuators to affect the world. So you might think of our model as really a robot with a CTM brain. Okay, so why would a robot with a CTM brain feel consciousness? Well, we have one definition already, which is that conscious attention is the reception of the broadcast, the global broadcast of the chunk, the chunk that's in short-term memory. Okay, and where am I not getting next? Okay, but how or will the CTM experience subjective feelings? Okay, so at this point, they're saying paying attention, but those things that Johannes was talking about, what do you feel, and what Ronnie was talking about when you see a sunset or a beautiful rose or something like that, how will CTM experience this? And attention is not all you need. So now I'm going to talk about the coevolution of brainish and the model of the world. So the model of the world processor maintains models of the world and of CTM in this world. And the model of the world processor for us is widely distributed. In fact, we think of it technically as eventually being in part of every single processor. And the model of the world labels sketches in the model of the world with multimodal brainish gist, including labeling sketches of actuators as self when the CTM detects the actuators carrying out its request. So here we have a young infant who's discovering his left leg, and very soon his model of the world will label that leg self. That's what's happening here. So how does this whole thing really work in the model? How is brainish developed? How does this work? So let me give you a little idea of what happens here. So the newborn CTM starts out with a very, very foggy model of the world. And what we're going to do by fiat is say that CTM's first broadcasted chunk is the initial sketch in that model. So maybe some processor P0 at time 0 with certain weight W0 put in a chunk that got into short-term memory, got broadcast, okay? And we're going to call that broadcasted chunk the initial sketch. Now, notice that the gist here is null. There are no words, so there can't be any words in that gist. And we'll call the name of the initial sketch as P00. That's the name. It's a very short name. And if you like, you can call it Blob 0 in English. So that's your English version. I'm calling it P00 in Brainish. Okay, and the word P00 will point to the chunk, which has more information and generally have the gist and the weight there. And in general, Brainish words will be such pointers. So that will be our definition of Brainish words. They're pointers to broadcasted chunks. And of course, when the processors get these words, they already have in their dictionary, they can actually quickly look up. It's like having an ordinary dictionary, and they can find out the chunk which gives them the meaning of that word. That's important. So shortly, a primal word for pain will be created. And if you ever witnessed childbirth, you will know that everybody's anxious for that baby to cry, and they're very happy when they hear that first cry. So what's going on? Well, the oxygen gauge in our CTM has raised its concern for lack of oxygen and has submitted to the competition a sequence of chunks having negatively valenced weights of increasingly high absolute value. Okay, so some of those chunks will win the competition and get broadcast, and they signal an increasing desperate scream from the oxygen gauge, do something, do something. Okay, so as I said, all processors must do something when the weights are high negative. Okay, but these processors, they don't know what they're doing. So they just do what they do. So the motor actuator would get the arms and legs to flail. Have you ever seen that happening? The infant pees and poos. The vocal actuator screams and cries. And this last one works. The cry opens the lungs. The infant takes its first breath. And the oxygen gauge lowers the weights of its chunk. Just what we wanted. Okay, so suppose P1 was the address of that oxygen gauge, and at T1, it submitted a chunk with a very high negative weight, W1, that one got broadcast. Okay, and what we're going to say is P1, T1, we will say that's a primal word for pain. And if you like in English, you can call that pain 1 if you like. Okay, so now, Brainish gist will be just a string of Brainish words. We already have 2 words, and let's put them together. And these 2 words together are Blob 0 is in pain. That's our first little phrase in Brainish already here. Okay, and you might ask about the grammar. We're thinking more of like a Creole-type grammar, but this is how the gist sort of form, sequences of words. Okay, Brainish words and labels continue to evolve and build on each other. So, for example, when the CTM toddler skins its knee, its model of the world will already probably have a labeled self, was the knee. But now it gets a new label, skin knee pain, which is an evolution of earlier versions of pain. And now I have to come to the main definition here. Inspecting a broadcasted chunk means all processors note the chunk's weight. So, well, how important is that chunk that they've just gotten? And then they start to unpack all the words occurring in the gist. So the gist is a sequence of words, and they have to unpack those words. And unpacking means what they have to do is look up in their dictionary the chunk that word points to. In other words, get the meaning of that word, looking up and then getting the longer chunk, which has its gist and its weight. Okay, and now we have our axiom, which we call it axiom A, but it's the only axiom we have right now. We say inspecting a broadcasted chunk. So we're mathematicians, so you have axioms. I see the 0, 0. I'm going to have a couple more seconds here. Inspecting a broadcasted chunk, the axiom says, evokes in CTM a subjective experience, and the intensity and valence of the evoked experience depends on W. Now, this axiom really is an evolved axiom. It starts at a primal level, and we say inspecting a primal broadcasted chunk evokes a primal subjective experience. So inspecting a chunk that has a gist, for example, with pain 1, will evoke that initial feeling of pain. And then the evolved part of the axiom says, inspecting a broadcaster chunk with an evolved gist G, so G is now evolved, the larger gist, evokes a fusion of subjective experience evoked by the words in G. In other words, evoked by the words pointed to by the words, evoked by the chunks pointed to by the words in P, in G. Okay, so that's our axiom, and now we can define conscious attention in CTM. It arises when, first of all, CTM pays conscious attention to a chunk, it's gotten it, and then it goes and inspects. It takes note of the weight, and then it unpacks those words in G and gets the fusion. So by axiom A, conscious awareness in CTM evokes a subjective experience. And as CTM becomes consciously aware of more and more broadcasted chunks, the model of the world processor may call attention to this fact. And then the word PT, the pointing to a chunk that calls attention to this, becomes a brainish word for consciously aware or conscious in English. And the model of the world processor labels the sketch of CTM in the model of the world with conscious. And then when CTM inspects a broadcaster chunk with the label sketch CTM conscious, that's the gist, those are just words. When it inspects it, it goes in and gets the meaning of CTM, gets the meaning of conscious. CTM will experience by axiom A, by our axiom, a fusion of those subjective experiences, and so then CTM will feel itself conscious. So this is very kindred in spirit to neuroscientist Michael Graziano's attention schema theory. It's also in spirit to philosopher Dan Dennett's view of consciousness. And let me just end with a confirmation from human experiences, some consequences of mislabeling. So Cotard syndrome is a syndrome when people feel that they're dead. And that would be like our CTM in its model of the world having the label dead. Body integrity identity disorder is when people feel some of their extremities are not theirs. So, for example, their limb is not theirs, their lower leg, and they want to have it amputated. In the U.S., no doctor will do it, I suspect, here neither. But what's happening is in their model of the world, or in our CTM's model of the world, that limb is labeled not self. And then, of course, it's the opposite effect. If you've already had your arm amputated, people do feel it's itching, or there's the phantom limb syndrome, itching, or it hurts. And in that sense, their arm is labeled self still for a while. And of course, delusional disorders, for example, when the CTM sees that its best friend is a spy, that is labeled that way. Okay, summary and conclusion. The CTM is a simple formal mathematical model of consciousness that is clearly buildable. At a high level, it exhibits phenomena associated with human consciousness. It aligns and integrates many of the main theories of consciousness and addresses Kevin Mitchell's 45 questions. What should a real theory of consciousness encompass? And before I get to the last page, I just want to say that you heard earlier that there was a competition between like the global neuronal workspace theory and IIT, integrated information theory. And we're saying that our model aligns with both of those theories and aligns with 10 other theories as well. And how can we say that when they've shown to be different? Well, one of the reasons we can say that is, first of all, many of these theories are compatible. So that in those tests that were done with these competitions, they mapped global workspace to the front of the brain, and they mapped IIT to the back of the brain. And so they showed differences, but we're not mapping it to any particular place. We're just saying this functionality, the functionality of global workspace, the functionality of integration, of feedback is very important in our machine. So both of those notions are very important. They're very compatible. We're not mapping that to special places in the brain. And I think that's a suggestion also for the neuroscientists to be a little bit more flexible in terms of what they're saying of where their theories are mapping to as well. So I think from our paper, which we say AA consciousness never, all those, we have those comments I just made in detail there, and you can look at it, and the paper's on archive, and you're welcome to look at it, and thank you very much.
Yeah.